Airport security aimed a gun at a black CEO during an illegal search, then froze when he calmly revealed he was licensed to carry. They thought intimidation would make him submit. They didn't realize the man they targeted once built weapons smarter than their fear. Subscribe if you believe no one is above the law they twist. "Step this way for a routine check," Sergeant Rusk said, his voice low, almost too casual. Elias Varon didn't respond immediately. He glanced once at the man's badge, then shifted his gaze to the second officer, Dalen, who stood just off to the side, arms crossed, watching with a strange kind of stillness. The atmosphere around the checkpoint shifted. It wasn't loud or aggressive. It was quiet. Intentionally so, like a theater stage moments before the curtain rises. Without a word, Elias adjusted the cuff of his charcoal suit and followed. The sideline area was partitioned from the main security corridor by a series of glass dividers, tinted just enough to obscure the details from the public eye, but transparent enough to make sure everyone could see that something was happening. A show, controlled, choreographed. The hum of overhead lights filled the space, blending with the low beeps of scanners and murmurs of passengers behind them. Elias placed his briefcase on the inspection table, undoing the latches himself before either officer asked. Inside were the tools of his trade, neatly organized files, an encrypted laptop, and a biometric storage case that housed sensitive documents, none of which were illegal or unexpected for a man of his position. Still, Rusk raised an eyebrow, then gave a slow nod to Dalen, who stepped forward. "Traveling for work?" Dalen asked, almost too pleasantly. His hands already hovered over the contents of the case. "Always," Elias said coolly. His voice remained steady, but his mind catalogued everything. Tone shifts, posture, where each man stood, how close their hands were to their belts. "Where to?" Rusk asked, starting to circle behind him. "Ralden City. Government Summit." Elias offered the answer without emotion. He knew this dance, knew when small talk wasn't small at all. Dalen picked up the encrypted drive, turned it in his hand. "That's a lot of security for some PDFs." "That's a lot of assumption for someone in uniform," Elias said, not unkindly but deliberately. The air stiffened. Behind the mirrored panel to their right, the reflection of a third man appeared. A silhouette at first, then fully visible as he stepped into the light. A stocky build, squared shoulders, salt and pepper hair cropped tight. The badge on his dark blue shirt read, "Security Chief Nolan Creer." He didn't enter, not yet, but he watched, and he smirked. That smile told Elias everything. This wasn't about protocols. This wasn't random. This wasn't even personal. It was something else. Still, Elias stood motionless, disciplined. His father used to say, "You only bend when you plan to snap back harder." It was a lesson that had served him well from boardrooms to battlefield-adjacent deals. Now, it served him here. "Open your jacket," Rusk said suddenly, stepping closer. "Excuse me?" Elias turned slowly, the faintest narrowing in his eyes. "You heard me," Rusk repeated. "Standard pat-down. Need you to open your jacket and face the glass. There's been no alarm. No scanner issue. No irregularity in my documentation," Elias said, measured, controlled. "Routine inspection," Dalen echoed, a smirk of his own forming. Elias saw Creer shift slightly behind the glass, speaking into a handheld radio. The moment felt rehearsed. Elias turned toward the glass, but his fingers itched with awareness. He knew this setup, escalation by manipulation. Make the subject uncomfortable, provoke a reaction, then claim non-compliance. Still, he complied, unsnapped a single button, spread his suit jacket open. Rusk stepped in, hands methodical but not professional. He moved with slow exaggeration, tapping down Elias's arms, sides, waist, then, without warning, unfastened Elias's belt with an unnecessary tug. Elias's head turned sharply. "That's not protocol." "Looking for concealed storage compartments," Rusk said, his eyes daring Elias to object. From the corner of his vision, Elias spotted a few civilians on the other side of the glass wall pause. A man with a stroller, a teenage boy with headphones, a businessman with a rolling bag. They weren't close enough to hear, but they saw. They saw the way Elias was being handled. A few eyebrows raised, some phones tilted ever so slightly. Elias didn't flinch, didn't frown, but inside, his thoughts moved fast, pieces sliding into place. They weren't searching for drugs or weapons. They were searching for justification, a reason to escalate. He knew why. His company, Valor Core Systems, had just finalized the prototype schematics for Project Auric, a clean energy defense platform that could reroute power systems in hostile zones. It was worth billions and, more importantly, could shift the balance of national security contracts. Only 3 men had access to the encryption. Elias was one. This wasn't about safety. This was sabotage. "Everything checks out?" Elias asked flatly as Rusk finished the unnecessary search. "Not quite," came a new voice. Creer had entered the room. He walked with calm authority, but his eyes carried something colder, intent. Not rage, not malice. Something even more dangerous. Confidence. "Mr. Varen," Creer said, approaching the table. "Your name came up on our compliance sweep. Your firm's recent classification upgrade triggered a flag." "A flag?" Elias asked. "By who?" Creer ignored the question. "We're conducting a deeper review. Considering your access level and history of international defense travel, we need full transparency. You have my identification," Elias said, gesturing toward his ID already scanned into their system. "You have my travel manifest. My cargo declarations are pre-cleared, and yet," Creer said, stepping closer, "you carry encrypted drives, disassembled electronics, a biometric case, and that's suspicious." Elias slid a card across the counter, a Level 6 contractor pass with federal verification seal. "I travel under special clearance." Creer looked at it. Didn't touch it, didn't read it, just looked. Then he leaned in slightly. "Special clearance doesn't mean immunity." Elias's eyes didn't move. "Neither does your badge mean authority without oversight." The words dropped like lead. Rusk shifted behind him. Dalen paused over the open case, clearly debating his next move. Then Creer stepped back and gave a slight nod. "Let's make sure everything checks out," Rusk said, though his tone carried more threat than professionalism. The click of the latch behind Elias Varen was sharp, unnatural. He turned slightly, eyes narrowing as the door to the inspection bay sealed with a slow, mechanical hum. That sound didn't belong to routine protocol. It sounded more like a trap closing. He stood motionless for a beat, measuring the silence that followed. No announcements, no foot traffic, not even the murmur of distant passengers. Just the low buzz of overhead lights and the artificial stillness of a room designed to intimidate. Across the room, Officer Dallin was already elbow-deep in Elias's briefcase, scattering documents like playing cards. Pages bearing military clearance codes fluttered across the counter, each stamped, encrypted, and confidential. The blueprints for Project Auric were among them, though the sensitive components were digitally masked. Still, it was more than enough to trigger alarms if handled improperly. "Never seen a man so clean act so nervous," Dalen said without looking up, his voice laced with mock amusement. Elias kept his voice level. "Never seen a professional act so unprofessional." Dalen paused, the jab landing harder than he expected. He looked up, met Elias's calm stare, and for a flicker of a second seemed unsure. Then, smirking, he went back to digging. Elias's gaze shifted. Sergeant Rusk was hovering nearby, arms folded tightly, his holster resting conveniently within reach. His jaw clenched and unclenched like a man waiting for an excuse. On the other side of the one-way mirror, Chief Nolan Creer raised a radio to his lips, muttered something too low to hear, and then disappeared behind the reflective pane. Elias's instincts sharpened. This wasn't inspection. This was theater, and he was the target. He took a slow breath, centering himself. Everything about this felt deliberate, the way Dalen handled the documents without gloves, the way the room had been cleared, the strange absence of oversight. He knew the law. He knew that without cause, without paperwork, this level of scrutiny was unlawful. But the rules didn't matter if no one was watching, and the people in this room were banking on that. "Excuse me," Elias said, stepping forward as Dalen reached for one of the encrypted drives. Rusk moved immediately, blocking his path with an arm that was more threat than barrier. His eyes narrowed with satisfaction. "You think those codes make you untouchable?" he said, voice tight. "Men like you think they own the system." Elias studied him, cool and unblinking. "Interesting, considering my company helped design it." That struck a nerve. Rusk's hand dropped just slightly, brushing the edge of his sidearm. The motion was subtle, but clear. A warning. Dalen chuckled, flipping open another folder like it was a magazine. "Fancy stamps. What are these, comic books for the military?" "Those documents are protected under federal contract," Elias said, his voice low and steady. "Every fingerprint you leave is a breach." "Big words for a man behind a locked door," Rusk murmured. Before Elias could reply, the inner door hissed open and Chief Creer stepped in, clipboard in hand, expression carved from stone. He moved like a man who already knew the outcome. "Mr. Varon," he began, walking in slow, deliberate steps. "This inspection just turned into a compliance review. Step back and open your jacket." Elias didn't move. Not out of defiance, but calculation. His mind ran through every possible outcome, every angle of leverage. This wasn't about airport security. It never was. They weren't looking for contraband or illegal weapons. They were probing for something deeper. Information, access, disruption. His travel schedule had been tight-lipped, his manifest classified. Yet somehow these men were waiting. Someone wanted him exposed, discredited, perhaps worse. "What's your cause?" Elias asked, tone cool as steel. "You have no warrant." No written order. Creer didn't blink. Directive 9, C-12, applies to all civilian contractors transporting government prototypes. We're within jurisdiction. That directive applies under joint agency operations, Elias replied, unmoved. "I see no federal liaison in this room." Creer offered a thin smile, then tapped his tablet. "We're the liaison now." Dalen stepped back from the table with a mocking bow. "Your move, suit." Elias slowly removed his blazer, revealing the sleek, reinforced travel vest beneath, standard for defense tech logistics personnel. Creer's eyes scanned it, calculating. Rusk stepped closer, the heat of tension rising. "Let's see what's underneath." "Compliance, remember?" Elias opened the vest, revealing compartments lined with digital tags and biometric locks. One of them blinked red, still sealed. Creer's gaze lingered on it. "We'll be opening that next," he said. "You'll need authorization from my command liaison," Elias responded. "The locks are traceable." "Any forced access will trigger a federal alert, unless the alert never gets sent," Creer said, voice dropping to a whisper. For a moment, time froze. Elias felt the weight of it, the noose tightening, the stakes hardening. But he didn't waver. The silence was broken by Rusk, who stepped around Elias and began unfastening his belt without warning. "This is unnecessary," Elias snapped, pulling slightly away. "Checking for concealed storage," Rusk muttered, eyes gleaming with false innocence. Elias's hands curled into fists, not in preparation for violence, but restraint. Everything in him burned to act, to defend his dignity. But he knew better. Reaction was the trap. Outside the glass, a few figures gathered, travelers pausing, watching the commotion through the blurry tint of the observation wall. Their shapes were vague, uncertain. No phones were raised, No help was coming. "I have done nothing to warrant this," Elias said firmly, his voice cutting the air. Creer tilted his head. "That's what makes it fun." Dalen, now emboldened, moved toward the sealed case with a small crowbar. Elias turned sharply. "Don't touch that." "Or what?" Rusk growled. Elias met his eyes, unblinking. "Or you'll answer to someone far above your rank." The tension reached its peak then, sharp, hot, and ready to explode. Rusk's hand hovered over his holster. Creer gave a slight nod. Dalen hesitated, then continued. The steel crowbar tapped the side of the biometric case. Rusk's voice came low and poisonous. "One more word, and you'll regret it," he hissed. Elias didn't speak. He simply stared back. Interesting, he thought. They're not searching for weapons. They're searching for evidence. The buckle clattered to the floor. It didn't fall by accident. Rusk had unfastened Elias's belt with a slow, deliberate tug, the kind meant to provoke rather than inspect. The sound echoed unnaturally loud against the sterile walls of the inspection bay, cutting through the quiet hum of the security machinery like a dropped coin in a funeral hall. Behind the glass partition, passengers began to take notice. A few turned their heads. Others simply paused, sensing something had shifted. Tension, like static electricity, hung in the air. Elias didn't move. His suit jacket was open now, his belt loosened under the pretense of a search, his dignity hanging by threads, but his face betrayed nothing. He stared straight ahead, jaw set, dark eyes locked on Security Chief Nolan Creer, who stood just a few feet away, tapping slowly at a sleek black tablet. The man wasn't even pretending to follow standard procedures anymore. "You travel with encrypted drives containing restricted data," Creer said, his voice smooth, almost conversational, like a professor lecturing an inattentive student. He circled slowly, his footsteps soft against the polished floor. "That's suspicious." "I travel with government clearance," Elias replied, sliding his ID across the metal counter without breaking eye contact. His voice was low but firm, controlled. Every syllable was chosen with precision. No panic, no anger, just facts. Creer didn't even glance at the identification card. He waved lazily at Rusk with the back of his hand. "Continue," he muttered. Rusk grunted and resumed the so-called pat-down, but it was no longer subtle. His hands moved with irritation, tugging the edges of Elias's suit, tapping forcefully along his ribs, even slipping into the inner lining of the blazer like a thief digging through someone else's pockets. Across the room, Officer Dalen leaned casually against the wall, arms folded, smirking like a boy watching a prank unfold. "You CEOs," Dalen said loudly enough for the room to hear. "Think your fancy badges let you skip lines and bend rules. Must be nice." Elias turned his head slightly, meeting Dalen's smirk with a stare of stone. "You're enjoying this far too much for it to be legal." Dalen shrugged. "You're the one hiding stuff." Elias's nostrils flared ever so slightly, but he held his ground. His mind wasn't focused on the insult. It was assessing the pattern. The way Rusk lingered on certain pockets. The way Creer never looked him directly in the eyes. The deliberate delays. The smirks. The excessive searching. None of this was protocol. This wasn't security. This was extraction. And someone wanted something from him badly. Then it clicked. They weren't just looking for weapons. They were looking for the drive. The encrypted file. Project Auric. The realization tightened his chest, not with fear, but with clarity. Auric wasn't just a classified schematic. It was the next-generation blueprint for a clean energy transfer weapon, the kind that could shift global defense hierarchies overnight. His team had built it in total secrecy, under a joint federal oversight protocol. Only a handful of people had ever seen the blueprints. If these men were after it, it meant one of those people had leaked his location. His thoughts raced. Survival first, justice second. He began cataloging every detail. the timestamp on Creer's tablet, the serial on Dalen's badge, the reflection of the glass that showed a blurred figure still watching from behind the two-way mirror. Every element mattered now. This wasn't just about getting out, it was about remembering everything for the fight ahead. Suddenly, Dalen lunged forward and shoved him hard into the metal inspection table. The force knocked Elias off balance. His hands splayed out instinctively to break the fall. Metal creaked beneath his palms. Pain radiated through his wrist as his hip struck the corner. The sudden violence drew a sharp gasp from someone behind the glass. "Hey!" Elias snapped, his voice sharp now, authoritative. That was unnecessary. Creer didn't flinch. In fact, he raised his hand and said coldly, "Draw your weapon." The words froze the air. Rusk's reaction was instant. His hand shot to his sidearm, fingers wrapping around the grip with practiced ease. In a heartbeat, a black service pistol was drawn and leveled, dead center at Elias's chest. Elias didn't blink. The barrel hovered less than 2 feet from his heart. "One more word," Rusk hissed, eyes narrowed, finger grazing the trigger, "and you'll regret it." The barrel of the gun gleamed under the fluorescent inspection lights, inches from Elias Varen's chest. He didn't move. The silence was thick, humming with unspoken threats. Rusk's arm was steady, but Elias could see the tension in his fingers, the faint twitch of nerves behind forced aggression. One squeeze, one shout, one misread breath could turn this from intimidation to tragedy. But Elias had spent a lifetime reading moments like these, not just in boardrooms and negotiations, but in the silence before a storm. He wasn't just a CEO, he was a strategist, and this was his battlefield now. Behind him, the dull thrum of airport scanners hummed with mechanical indifference. The glass walls reflected the scene like a stage. Elias, calm in his tailored charcoal suit, his belt unfastened, briefcase open on the steel table. Rusk, taut and ready. Dalen, hands half-curled in hesitation. And behind them, just beyond the mirrored glass, the smirking shadow of Chief Nolan Creer. No one spoke. No one breathed louder than they had to. Elias's eyes didn't leave the gun, but his mind moved faster than any bullet could travel. This wasn't about safety. It never was. They wanted him to flinch, to lash out, to give them an excuse, but he wouldn't. "I said, search the case again," Creer snapped suddenly, his voice slicing through the silence like a blade. His calm had begun to crack. Dalen, startled by the barked order, stepped back to the briefcase. He hesitated for a split second before leaning in. Elias saw it, just a flicker of curiosity in the man's eyes. Not malice, not loyalty, just curiosity, and maybe the first sliver of doubt. Dalen's fingers ran along the inner lining of the case, then paused. He tapped twice on the frame, a hollow echo. Something was there. "What the?" he muttered under his breath. With a small metal tool from his belt, Dalen pried at the side panel. A thin seam gave way. A faint hiss sounded as the biometric seal disengaged, and the hidden compartment opened with a smooth mechanical click. And there it was. Nestled inside black foam lining, under coated lock, was a disassembled compact rifle receiver. Sleek, metallic, legal, registered, military grade. Not just a weapon, an engineered component designed for defense-grade transportation, meant to be stored this way, disassembled for safety, authorized for elite clearance holders. For a few seconds, no one said a word. Elias broke the silence. "You said you were looking for weapons," he said evenly, voice clear and calm. "You just found one, licensed to me." Rusk's eyes widened slightly. He didn't lower the gun, but his lips parted, his confidence faltering. "You can't," he began, his voice taut with disbelief. "Actually," Elias interrupted, his gaze steady as stone, "I can. Defense contract personnel are allowed licensed carry for classified shipments. Section 417 of the Federal Transit Act." He paused. Would you like me to cite the case rulings as well? Creer's face twitched. The plan was unraveling. He had counted on Elias folding, on panic, on protest. He hadn't expected this, the preparedness, the calm, the law backing every move. Creer stepped forward, but even his boots sounded hesitant now. Let's verify that, he said tightly, nodding toward the weapon, but no one moved to touch it. Elias took a small step forward, not threatening, just deliberate. I wouldn't recommend it, he said softly. Tampering with secured federal equipment while armed personnel stand by with drawn weapons? That might be harder to explain than you think. Rusk glanced at Creer, then Dalen. The once coordinated intimidation now looked fractured. The script they had memorized had lost its final pages. Elias kept going. His words weren't loud, but each one landed like a measured strike. You've aimed a weapon at a federal contractor, he said. You've unlawfully interfered with a protected shipment. And you've violated 3 protocols on procedural detainment. Rusk's arm trembled. Dalen looked like he wanted to disappear. Creer clenched his jaw. Elias leaned in slightly, his voice lowering just enough to force them to listen closely. Every second you delay an apology is another second you'll wish you hadn't wasted. The silence in the room grew electric. Power, Elias thought, isn't about who draws first, it's about who stays unshaken. The taser's low whine joined the sharp click of boots as 2 guards entered the inspection bay, each moving with the controlled tension of men expecting conflict. One clutched a camera already recording. The other's grip tightened around the black casing of a charged taser. Creer pointed without looking. Record everything, he snapped, his eyes still locked on Elias. But Elias Varon didn't flinch. He stepped forward, his presence grounded, voice crisp. Good idea, he said, his tone neither angry nor afraid, just factual, unshaken. Let the record show who escalated. That one sentence made the room feel colder. The words hung in the air like static. Dalen, still hovering near the equipment table, adjusted the camera too quickly. His hands were shaking. Rusk's aim, still focused on Elias's chest, visibly wavered. He tried to mask it by adjusting his stance, but the shift was too late. The illusion of control was slipping. Elias's eyes flicked briefly to the mirrored glass, aware that someone, somewhere, was likely watching. His inner thoughts were calm, but sharp. This isn't about fear. This is about leverage. If they wanted to push him into a mistake, they were running out of chances. He wasn't going to give them one. Creer took a step closer, closing the space between them, his jaw tight and his smirk faltering. You're obstructing federal officers, he said, but the edge in his voice no longer carried command. It carried frustration. I'm complying, Elias replied. You're the ones with weapons drawn in a non-lethal inspection zone. That's on record now, too. Creer opened his mouth to respond, but before a word could form, the corridor exploded with a voice that cut through the tension like a blade. Stand down. The entire room froze. Even the hum of the scanner seemed to go silent for a moment. Colonel Mason Hale stepped into the inspection bay, flanked by 2 men in black security fatigues bearing the insignia of the airport's Internal Operations Division. His face was carved in command, eyebrows low, mouth a thin line, eyes assessing the room in one sweeping glance. Rusk's weapon lowered immediately, almost as if by instinct. Dalen backed a step toward the wall, camera still recording but forgotten in his hand. Creer tried to reclaim authority, squaring his shoulders. Colonel, this is a sensitive search involving... Hale cut him off with a raised hand and a voice full of authority. Mr. Varon, he asked, ignoring Creer entirely. His tone shifted as recognition set in. You were scheduled for clearance transport. Elias gave a slight nod, controlled. That transport never arrived, he said coolly. A pulse of realization passed through the room. The dynamic had shifted. Rank now outweighed whatever scheme Creer had tried to orchestrate. Elias moved with care. He reached into the side of the inspection table and retrieved the disassembled rifle components, still untouched, still within their legal transport casing. He laid them out, piece by piece, on the metal surface, not to intimidate, but to demonstrate transparency. "This," Elias said, gesturing to the components with a measured tone, "is legal." Then he turned his eyes unwavering to the officers still standing. "That," he added, pointing to the side where Rusk's gun still hung half-raised in his hand, "is not." The silence that followed was loaded. The air no longer belonged to Creer, or to Rusk, or to the trembling Dalen. It belonged to the moment, one saturated with consequences. Creer's smirk, the one he had worn like armor from the moment Elias entered the checkpoint, cracked. Colonel Hale took one step forward. His voice dropped in volume, but not in weight. "Sergeant Rusk." "Officer Dalen." "Chief Creer. You are hereby relieved of duty pending internal inquiry. Surrender your weapons and badges." All three hesitated, but the sound of boots entering behind Hale, more security officers filling the corridor, shattered whatever resistance they might have considered. One by one, badges hit the table. Rusk's face was pale. Dalen looked like he might be sick. Creer didn't speak as he unfastened his belt clip, but his eyes were seething, not with guilt, but with fury at having lost control. Elias stood motionless, spine straight, jaw locked. He didn't smile. There was no triumph in his expression, just focus, purpose. A deep internal knowing that something had just shifted, and it would ripple far beyond the polished tiles of that inspection bay. As Creer was led past him in cuffs, Elias didn't speak. He didn't need to. The moment was already echoing louder than any words. Colonel Hale turned back to Elias with a firm nod. "You'll be escorted to a secure debriefing room," he said. "I'll see you there shortly." Elias nodded once in return and allowed himself the smallest exhale. His jaw stayed tight. His mission to Ralden would wait, but something larger had begun forming in its place, something that couldn't be measured in contracts or credentials. This wasn't about just reaching a destination anymore. This was about reclaiming the route itself. And as the doors sealed behind the disgraced officers, Elias's thoughts settled into a single realization, one that hummed through him louder than any scanner. Sometimes, he thought, watching them led away, the only thing stronger than a weapon is the reason you carry one. Elias Varen's story. Chapter expansion. The door clicked shut behind him. Elias didn't flinch, even as the silence in the debriefing chamber settled around him like a sealed vault. The walls were glass, but they offered no transparency, just the illusion of oversight. Overhead, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting pale reflections across the polished floor. Colonel Mason Hale stood at the head of the narrow table, his frame rigid, the crisp folds of his uniform as sharp as the edge in his voice. "You were targeted," Hale said flatly. Elias met the colonel's eyes without hesitation, his stance composed but alert. He didn't need dramatics to sense the gravity in Hale's tone. It was embedded in the way his shoulders refused to relax, in the furrow forming between his brow, in the folder he didn't bother to open. Hale tapped his finger on the glass tabletop. The authorization for that checkpoint inspection didn't originate from Norvale Terminal. It was pushed through a red-level clearance, classified and restricted to Central Command channels that landed like a dropped blade. For a second, Elias didn't speak. His mind was already moving, mapping possible access points, running the chain of custody on Project Auric in reverse. Red-level clearance meant top brass, someone at the directorate, maybe higher. Only a handful of people even knew Auric's encryption path, and fewer had a motive to burn him in broad daylight. He narrowed his eyes slightly. That narrows it to less than 6 names. Hale nodded grimly. Someone within that circle authorized your targeting. Creer, Rusk, and Dalen were following orders, but not mine. A cold pulse flickered beneath Elias's collarbone. He felt neither fear nor anger, but something worse, certainty. This wasn't a breach of protocol. It was a precision strike disguised as one. They hadn't been trying to catch him off guard. They wanted him neutralized. Reputation first, then career, then freedom. Hale paced to the far wall, stopping beneath the digital board where timestamps of the incident still blinked like scars. He turned back. There's more. He slid a folder forward, thinner than Elias expected. They're claiming you resisted. Claimed you made a move for a weapon. A low breath escaped Elias, not quite a laugh, but the ghost of one. If I had, he said calmly, we wouldn't be having this conversation. The colonel didn't smile. That's not how the media will see it. Or internal affairs. You know how this works, Elias leaned forward, hands clasped lightly. They're building a narrative. They already started, Hale replied. We've intercepted early edits of surveillance footage, cropped angles, muted audio. Someone's rewriting the record before it ever goes public. Elias exhaled through his nose. The room suddenly felt smaller, not physically but politically. His instincts had been correct the moment Rusk blocked him at the inspection bay. But now the ambition behind that act loomed clearer. Someone high up wanted Project Auric compromised, and Elias buried with it. He stood slowly, the chair legs scraping softly against the tile. They won't stop at humiliation. No, Hale agreed. They'll escalate. And if they can't discredit you, they'll provoke you. Elias turned toward the glass wall, looking out into the corridor beyond. Media personnel were gathering already. He could see the flashes, hear the distant murmur of speculation. He recognized the rhythm of spin before it started. Reporters summoned by anonymous tips, headlines half written by hands behind curtains. Somewhere, someone was making him the villain before he could speak. His jaw tightened. I didn't come here to fight shadows, Elias said, voice low but steady. But if they want a war of narratives, I'll give them something they can't erase. Hale folded his arms. Be cautious. Whoever accessed that clearance code, they had full knowledge of your manifest, your project files, your route. That's not just betrayal, it's a kill order in a suit. Elias nodded once. His thoughts moved like a strategy map. Locations, names, digital footprints, contingency plans. He didn't need emotion now. He needed precision. As he walked to the door, Hale's voice stopped him one last time. We'll dig, Elias. But you have to understand, when truth threatens power, power doesn't always retreat. Elias didn't look back. He paused, hand on the doorframe, staring at the reflection in the glass. The man looking back wasn't just a CEO anymore. He was a witness, a liability, a threat. He opened the door, stepping into the corridor's flood of light and cameras. Whispers swirled. High-profile CEO. Military contractor incident. Airport altercation. The story had already begun, and he wasn't the author. But he would be the ending. His thoughts sharpened to a single truth. When truth threatens power, he thought, power often chooses violence. They weren't just searching, Elias said, his voice low, steady, and sharp as a scalpel. The lights in the secure Valor Corps conference room cast long shadows across the frosted glass walls. They were hunting for something. Across the table, Ryland Keene leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his jaw tightening. A silver pen tapped rhythmically against his notepad. The Auric prototype, he asked, though his tone carried less curiosity and more dread. Elias gave a single nod, eyes locked on the digital security map on the wall screen. They knew exactly when I'd be at that checkpoint. Down to the gate. Someone leaked my manifest. Damon Stroud stood near the window, his broad shoulders tense beneath his fitted blazer. The ex-military officer had seen field betrayals before, but this felt different, colder, calculated. You think Creer was just a pawn? He asked without turning. No, Elias replied. He stood, walking slowly toward the monitor, gaze narrowing as if searching through data that wasn't yet displayed. He was the match. The fire started somewhere higher. The room fell into silence, each man turning over the implications in his mind. Outside, a cargo drone zipped past the window, humming like an insect in a hurry, its red light blinking through the glass. Then Elias's secure phone buzzed, a low, encrypted vibration from the inner jacket pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the display. No ID. Level 5 access required. Without hesitation, he unlocked it using both thumbprint and retinal scan. The screen blinked once. Then a voice, digitally distorted, calm but urgent, came through. "Mr. Varen," it said, "we need to meet. Your project has enemies inside the Directorate." The call cut instantly. No trace, no timestamp, just dead silence on the line. Elias slowly lowered the phone, brows furrowed. "Who was that?" Rylan asked, already on his feet. "I don't know," Elias replied, still processing, "but it confirms everything." This isn't paranoia anymore. Damon crossed the room and locked the main door manually, his instincts already shifting into tactical mode. Where do they want to meet? They didn't say. Elias's mind was already moving, reconstructing old safe spots, hidden nodes, fallback protocols. "But I'll decide the place." Rylan stepped closer. "You're not going alone." "I am," Elias said, his voice quiet but firm. "We don't know how deep this goes. If it's a trap, I won't take anyone with me." Damon didn't argue, but his jaw tensed. "Then let me pick the location. Something we control. We use the old storage hangar near Terminal D. Cameras are offline there, no flight traffic, and I'll place a quiet perimeter." Elias nodded once. "Make it happen." Before Damon could respond, a secured terminal at the back of the room pinged. Rylan walked over, inputting credentials. His expression darkened as he read the encrypted memo that flashed on screen. "It's from Hale," he said slowly. "Rusk and Dalen. They're missing. Escaped custody an hour ago." The holding center never registered the release. Elias's hands tightened around the chair in front of him. The leather creaked softly. "Then it was never about containment," Elias said. "They were never meant to stay detained." A heavy quiet settled again, the kind that felt like the breath before a thunderclap. Rylan turned away from the screen. "You're being drawn into something deeper than an airport ambush." Elias's voice dropped, almost a whisper. "Sometimes," he muttered, "corruption hides best in uniforms." They aimed a gun at a CEO while illegally searching him, mocking his calm as if he were powerless. If you believe strength isn't in a badge but in justice, hit subscribe now. Truth loads faster than corruption. Tires screeched outside. The noise struck Elias like a thrown switchblade, sharp, sudden, impossible to ignore. The thick steel of the hangar walls trembled faintly, and his grip tightened around the handle of the compact briefcase as he pivoted toward the source. Floodlights hanging from the rafters flickered once as if sensing the shift in air. Then the roll-up doors at the far end exploded inward with a hydraulic hiss. "Directorate enforcement! On the ground!" The voice was hoarse and mechanical, muffled behind a helmet, but the intent was unmistakable. 5 men in matte black tactical armor swept in through the opening, each one with the same patch on their shoulder, a silver shield overlaid with a winged eye. Helmets reflected the white light like the gleam of a blade, and their rifles moved in unison, already locking onto targets. Captain Thorne reacted first. Without hesitation, he stepped in front of Elias and drew his sidearm, his stance suddenly trained and taut. "Move," he shouted. "Back exit, go." Elias didn't argue. His body jolted into motion, instinct overriding thought. He darted to the side, boots pounding the concrete as the first shots cracked through the air. The sound was deafening in the echo chamber of the hangar, bullets tearing into wooden crates, sending splinters flying like shrapnel. A crate burst open just inches from Elias's shoulder, its contents metal cylinders and loose wiring scattering like dice across the floor. He dove behind a rust-stained column, the cold steel slamming against his back. Heart racing, he peeked around the edge just long enough to see Thorne firing from behind a stack of crates, each shot controlled but desperate. The tactical unit advanced with precision, not recklessly but methodically, trained to neutralize, not to question. Elias's mind went into overdrive. This wasn't an arrest. This was containment. He unlatched the briefcase with a flick of his thumb, retrieving a small drive from a hidden side slot, barely larger than a coin but layered with biometric encryption. This wasn't the same drive they'd tried to steal at the airport. This was the insurance. The real data, encrypted files, duplicate logs, full timestamps, project branches. If they got this, it would be erased, twisted, and buried. "Captain," he called out, trying to stay low as he crawled across the floor. "We can't stay here." Thorne fired twice more before ducking into cover beside him. His left arm was bleeding. Elias hadn't noticed until now. Dark red soaking through the sleeve. Still, his grip on the pistol was firm. "They knew," Thorne hissed. "They knew the rendezvous." "Someone's feeding them live data." "Lorne?" Elias asked, breathless. Thorne shook his head. "Lorne gave the order. But this unit, these men, they're not just following protocol. They're protecting something." Another burst of gunfire cut through the air. A crate to their right collapsed, revealing a line of electrical panels behind it. Sparks flew as one panel shorted out, casting a portion of the hangar into a haze of dim blue and strobing shadows. Elias took a moment to center himself, his thoughts racing faster than the firefight. This was beyond sabotage. This was scorched earth, clear the board, erase all traces, leave nothing that could point back to the Directorate. They weren't just after him. They were after the narrative. He glanced at the blood seeping down Thorne's arm. "You can't keep firing like that," Elias said. "Doesn't matter," Thorne grunted. "I didn't come to survive." "I came to warn you. Then let me make it count," Elias replied, holding up the drive. Thorne's eyes flicked to it, narrowing slightly. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a smaller, unmarked chip, black, finger-length, sealed in carbon casing. "Take this," he muttered, pressing it into Elias's palm. "Everything on Lorne. Surveillance logs, transactions, meetings, his wife's shell company, the dummy networks, airport directives, it's all on here." Elias took it with trembling fingers, barely able to breathe. "Why didn't you lead with this?" "I had to be sure you were ready to act," Thorne said, "that you wouldn't break." Before Elias could reply, a flashbang arced through the air. Time slowed again, just like it had in the inspection bay at the airport. Elias's body hit the floor as the grenade landed meters away. A white burst blinded his vision, deafening him with a thunderclap. His ears rang violently. Dazed, he crawled blindly toward the exit corridor. His hand clenched the drive like a lifeline. The sound of boots running toward him brought panic. Then a hand grabbed his shoulder, spinning him over. One of the masked operatives aimed a rifle at his chest. Elias didn't move. Then, gunfire. The operative stumbled, a bullet striking his shoulder from behind. Thorne, bleeding heavily but still upright, had taken the shot. He tried to fire again, but his arm failed him. The pistol slipped from his hand. He fell to one knee, coughing. Elias dragged himself to him. "You have to get out," Thorne rasped. "Drive, has fingerprints. Use it. Finish it. I'm not leaving you," Elias said, gripping his arm. "You will," Thorne said, forcing the words out, "because you're the last thread they can't cut." He pushed Elias back almost violently. Then sirens howled in the distance, security alarms not from the Directorate, but local law enforcement. Reinforcements were coming, and the enemy didn't want a shootout they couldn't control. "Go!" Thorne shouted one last time. Elias turned and ran, sprinting toward a side door as the tactical team scrambled to retreat. He didn't look back because he knew what he'd see. A man choosing loyalty over survival. As he reached the transport lot, he hotwired an abandoned freight truck and tore away from the airfield. heart pounding, dust kicking up behind the wheels. In the rearview mirror, the hangar shrank into the horizon, a silent war zone. Later, in the dim flicker of an abandoned communication substation, Elias locked the doors and activated a dormant AI interface, his hands shaking as he slotted in the drive Thorne had given him. The AI's voice was calm, synthetic. "Welcome back, Mr. Varen. Varen Protocol initiating trace all digital fingerprints," Elias whispered. "Show me where this leads." As data scrolled across the screen, Elias saw the name Helvian Strategic Holdings, Lorne's wife's company, tied to dummy network nodes that controlled airport security protocols. All routed through her, all pointing back to Lorne. And now, Elias had the key. He sat back, the glow of the monitor reflecting in his tired eyes. The drive, still stained with Thorne's blood, lay on the console beside him. "If they want to catch me," Elias muttered, voice quiet but cold, "they'll have to reveal who sent them." Gunfire erupted like thunder inside the hangar, metal clanging and echoing through the vast chamber as crates splintered and sparks danced across the concrete. Elias ducked behind a steel support column, his breath tight in his chest. The air smelled of rust, gunpowder, and burning rubber. Shouts from the incoming tactical unit overlapped. "Sweep left! Suppress fire! Targets moving!" Their movements practiced and sharp. The attack wasn't random. It was precise. They had come not to question, but to erase. Thorne had gone down fast. One burst from a rifle, 3 tight shots to the chest, and the man staggered backward, slamming into the hangar wall before collapsing near the threshold. Elias saw it out of the corner of his eye. "Thorne!" he shouted, barely heard over the barrage. He bolted low across the floor, rounds ricocheting off the ground behind him, every step a gamble. When he reached the wounded man, he dropped to his knees and pulled him into the partial shelter of a toppled crate. Thorne's face was pale, his breaths shallow and sharp. Blood was already soaking through his shirt, dark and fast. "Take the drive," he rasped, barely lifting his hand. Elias leaned in. "What drive?" Thorne reached under his vest with trembling fingers, pulling out a thin microchip sealed in rubber casing. He pressed it into Elias's palm, squeezing with the last of his strength. Inside, everything. Lorne's files. Elias closed his fingers around the chip as Thorne's body slackened, his eyes fixed but empty. There was no time to grieve, no time for anything but escape. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder, closer. He looked around. The exit was blocked. The main hangar doors had sealed again, but across the far side, half obscured by crates and oil drums, a utility door sat ajar. Beside it, an old transport truck, yellow and rusted, sat with keys dangling from the ignition. He didn't question it. Someone had left him a way out, or a trap. Either way, it was the only move left. He sprinted, low and fast, bullets chewing up the air behind him. Glass exploded over his shoulder. A warning round slammed into the wall near his head. He ducked, slid behind the truck, and yanked open the driver's side door. The keys jingled in his grip. One turn. The engine sputtered, coughed, then roared to life. Tires screeched as he slammed it into gear, flooring the accelerator. The truck lurched forward, tearing through a side panel of the hangar just as a wave of operatives burst through the entryway behind him. Outside, the cold air hit him like a slap, but it cleared his thoughts. Red and blue lights shimmered in the rearview mirror, slicing through the night. He veered off the main road, tires spitting gravel as he cut across an old service path leading toward the outer airfield boundary. His hands gripped the wheel with white-knuckled force, every nerve alive with tension. Minutes later, he reached an abandoned comm substation hidden behind a broken fence, a place he hadn't visited in years. He kicked open the rusted gate, parked beneath a crumbling overhang, and moved fast. Inside the station, dust hung like fog in the flashlight beam. Tangled wires, dead monitors, and shattered consoles filled the room. In the back, behind a rusted maintenance panel, Elias unearthed an old black case. He keyed in a 4-digit code and retrieved a compact AI terminal the size of a shoebox. The surface glowed softly when touched. "Varen," he said aloud, setting the chip beside it. "Initiate trace on drive content. Cross-reference known directorate communications. Search for origin patterns." The AI whirred to life, scanning the drive. A hum filled the silence, rising like tension in a wire. Lines of data streamed across a tiny monitor, and Elias leaned in as words began to scroll. Accessing encrypted logs. Cross-checking digital fingerprints. Matching transmission pathways. Then it appeared. Line by line, the truth unfurled. Security directives from Norvale International had not come from the airport chain of command. They had been rerouted, spoofed, originating from a dummy server registered under an innocuous business, Helvion Strategic Holdings. A deeper scan revealed the owner, registered under the legal name of Halvor Lorne's wife. Elias sat back, breath caught between triumph and fury. The setup wasn't just a rogue operation. It had been authorized, camouflaged behind layers of corporate shields. Lorne had used his own family to mask his sabotage, a betrayal of position, power, and trust, the kind of treachery that destroyed lives and empires. He stood, running a hand through his hair, trying to calm the fire climbing through his chest. He had proof, real proof. But it wasn't over. He couldn't just walk into a government building and hand it over. Lorne controlled the directorate, and the directorate controlled the narrative. They would say he stole the data. They would call him a traitor, a hacker, a threat, and the public, trained to trust the badge before the citizen, would believe them, at least at first. His gaze shifted to his sleeve, where Thorne's blood had dried into a dark smear. He touched it, the weight of the man's last words echoing in his mind. Inside. Everything. Elias closed his eyes for a moment, grounding himself. He could already hear the spin. CEO under investigation for classified theft. Defense contractor flees security checkpoint. Internal mole found in Valor Core systems. They would come hard and fast. But now he had something they didn't expect. Their lies had volume, but he had substance. As the AI stored and duplicated the data across multiple drives, Elias packed up his tools and checked the lock on the substation one final time. The truth was now in his hands. But truth alone wasn't enough. He needed a platform. He needed reach. He needed a weapon loud enough to shatter the silence they had depended on for years. He stared again at the red seal on the chip, Thorne's last act of defiance burning in his grip. Sometimes, he realized, staring at Thorne's blood on his sleeve, the truth needs a louder weapon. Flashbulbs popped as Elias Varen stepped into the briefing chamber, but he barely flinched. The click of cameras, the buzz of whispered speculation, the low murmur of impatient reporters, all of it folded into white noise behind his calm, unreadable face. His charcoal suit was flawless, his stride precise. To the press, he was the embattled CEO at the center of an intelligence scandal. To himself, he was a man stepping onto a battlefield where truth was the only weapon that mattered. Colonel Hale stood near the podium, flanked by 2 aides and a mounted projection screen. The banner behind them read, Joint Security Cooperation Briefing, a name bland enough to mislead, strong enough to excuse the gathering of so many national and international media outlets. Elias had chosen this setting deliberately. It was public, official, and, most importantly, live-streamed. Every second mattered now. Elias approached the microphone without waiting for introduction. His legal counsel, Malcolm Reed, remained a few paces behind, arms crossed, his silence as intentional as Elias's presence. Elias scanned the room once. He did not see individuals, only reflections of a system watching him with curiosity, suspicion, or perhaps dread. "I won't take much of your time," Elias began, voice clear, steady. "Today's events are a reminder that authority without accountability becomes corruption in uniform." The words cut clean through the tension in the room. Cameras zoomed in. Pens hovered midair. Reporters straightened. A moment later, a voice broke the spell. "Mr. Varon," came the drawl from the far left aisle. Heads turned. The crowd parted slightly. Walking with deliberate ease, Director Halvor Lorne emerged into view, dressed in a government-issue navy blazer, flanked by two plainclothes agents whose presence screamed intimidation. He moved like a man expecting applause, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "You're spreading falsehoods," Lorne continued smoothly, adjusting his cuff. "Dangerous ones. Ones that endanger national security." The room stiffened. The media had their headline. But Elias didn't blink. He stepped aside from the microphone and gestured toward Colonel Hale, handing over a small biometric drive. "Then, perhaps," he said, gaze unwavering, "the public should decide." Hale, who had remained stone-faced until now, inserted the drive into the podium console. A moment of stillness followed as the press screen came to life. The first image was silent surveillance footage from Norvale Airport's inspection bay. The timestamp glowed in the bottom corner. Creer's voice crackled through speakers. "Search the case again." The footage zoomed in, showing Officer Dalen prying open the briefcase, then freezing as the rifle receiver appeared. Then another angle. Rusk drawing his weapon, Elias with both hands raised, unmoving. Another cut. The encrypted orders from Lorne's directorate login, time-stamped and digitally signed, flashing across the screen. Then an overlay of the red-level clearance code used to authorize the inspection, originating from Helvion Strategic Holdings. Gasps rippled through the room. Some reporters dropped pens. Others stared open-mouthed at the evidence. Lorne's mask cracked. His lips twitched, his pupils dilated ever so slightly, and he took half a step back. Cameras turned. Suddenly, he wasn't the man in control. He was the man caught. Colonel Hale didn't wait. "Director Halvor Lorne," he said firmly, stepping forward. "You are hereby detained pending federal investigation for misuse of classified access, obstruction of oversight protocol, and conspiracy to sabotage federal contractors." The two plainclothes agents, realizing the shift, moved in on Lorne. One clicked handcuffs around his wrist while the cameras captured every second. Lorne opened his mouth, but the microphones weren't his anymore. He looked around, but no one met his eyes. Silence wasn't on his side now. Truth had stolen the spotlight. Elias didn't smile. He stepped back to the podium, waited for the murmuring to die down, and leaned in once more. "You aimed weapons at me to hide your lies," he said, his voice even, calm, deadly clear. "I aimed truth to reveal them." Elias froze mid-sip, the coffee in his hand suddenly bitter on his tongue. The screen in front of him, muted but unmistakable, displayed a grainy security feed from the east wing of the Federal Evidence Storage Facility. Two figures moved in shadow, entering through a side door marked as restricted. One of them turned briefly toward the camera. The resolution wasn't ideal, but the jawline, the posture, the nervous dart of the eyes were all too familiar. Rusk. The other man, slightly shorter, limped slightly as he followed behind. Dalen. Elias leaned in, his breath fogging the lower edge of the screen. Both men were supposed to be in federal custody. Their detainment had been confirmed by Colonel Hale himself. And yet, here they were, alive, moving with the ease of men who had keys, not chains. They weren't sneaking, they were operating. The timestamp was from just 6 hours ago. He rewound the footage and watched again. This time, he noticed it. A small, rolling crate between them. Standard transport bin. Numbered. And when Dalen cracked it open, the camera caught the gleam of a silver box inside. A secure evidence capsule, likely containing digital files or hardware components. Elias's gut twisted. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor of his private briefing suite in the Valor Corps Tower. The entire room was quiet, insulated from the noise of protesters and press gathering below. Outside his window, the company's front plaza was overrun by voices chanting his name, some in support, others in suspicion. But in here, the silence was absolute. A few taps summoned a separate feed, one linked to the facility's access logs. No entries, no exits. As if the two men had never been there. Either the system had been wiped, or worse, someone inside had never logged the breach to begin with. He picked up his encrypted phone and dialed a secure line. "Hail," Elias said when the call connected, skipping any greeting. "Mr. Varon," the colonel replied, his voice low and clipped. "I was just about to call. There's been a development." "I already know," Elias cut in. "Rusk and Dalen. They were never held, were they?" There was a long pause on the other end. Finally, Hale sighed. They were processed. But someone intervened. The transfer logs show they were moved for classified debriefing, 2 days after their arrest. And now they're at a restricted storage facility pulling classified material, Elias muttered, pacing slowly. "What was in that crate?" "I don't know. The inventory lists are scrambled, but if they took what I think they took—" Elias didn't need him to finish. "Then we've lost control of the leak." A sharp knock on the door interrupted the call. Damon Stroud entered, face grim. "We've got a second problem," he said, holding up a tablet. "One of the major investors, Greyline Equity, is pulling out. Public pressure. They want to wait and see how this all plays out." Elias's jaw clenched. "Let them wait." "We move forward anyway." Stroud hesitated. "There's more. Protesters outside are holding signs with your face crossed out. They're claiming you staged the airport incident to gain leverage over the directorate. It's picking up traction. The absurdity of it landed like a stone. They think I arranged to have a gun pulled on me? They think anything but the truth," Stroud replied. "And right now, without Hale publicly backing you, you're vulnerable." Elias returned to the screen. He replayed the moment Rusk and Dalen turned the corner, disappearing with the capsule. A piece of him felt like it had splintered. This was no longer a political battle or a fight for reform. It was personal. They weren't just trying to dismantle his reputation. They were recovering something dangerous, something unfinished. He dropped into the chair and pinched the bridge of his nose. "We're not dealing with cleanup anymore," he said quietly. "We're dealing with countermeasures." Stroud nodded. "Do we engage internal recon?" Elias shook his head. "Not yet. If we move too soon, they'll scatter. We need to let them think we're still stunned. And in the meantime—" "In the meantime," Elias said, glancing at the footage one last time, "we trace every signal, every access point, every piece of digital exhaust they left behind. They're not ghosts. They're arrogant, and arrogance leaves fingerprints." The screen flickered as he zoomed into the timestamp again. 2:43 a.m. Perfect window. No staff changes. No audits. It was timed. That meant someone orchestrated it. Likely the same shadow behind Halvor Lorne, the one who had stayed quiet while Lorne burned. The realization crept in like ice. Halvor had only been a proxy. The true architect of this operation was still in play, and Elias had just exposed himself again by winning too publicly, too cleanly. Victory, he understood now, was a spotlight, and some enemies waited for you to bask in it before they struck. He turned to the mirrored panel on the far wall. In the reflection he saw his own face, tired but not broken, sharpened by betrayal, strengthened by exposure. From behind him, Stroud asked, "Do we tell the board?" Elias stood slowly, straightening the lapels of his blazer. "No, not until we know what was taken, and who took it, understood." As Stroud left, Elias lingered in the quiet again. He looked out the window, at the lights flashing, the banners waving, the faces both angry and adoring. He wasn't afraid of enemies anymore. What worried him now were the allies who stayed silent. He returned to his desk, set the footage on loop, and leaned in once more. Dalen's limp, Rusk's confident stride, the weight of the capsule. All of it meant something. All of it would lead somewhere. "They're not finished," he muttered. The war that began at an airport checkpoint was about to resurface in shadows far more dangerous than before. Some threats, he realized, don't die, they wait. The knock at the door was not loud, but sharp. 3 calculated taps, each spaced exactly 2 seconds apart. Elias Varen stood from his desk, instantly alert. He glanced at the wall monitor where no delivery had been scheduled, no perimeter breach detected. Still, someone stood outside Valor Corps' executive entrance. When the door opened, no one was visible. Only a sealed black envelope lay at his feet, heavy as if weighed down by something more than paper. He picked it up slowly, examining the unmarked exterior. No return address, no name. Just heat-sealed edges and deliberate silence. Inside, a single bold line stared back at him. "You exposed one man. Now face the rest." Below it, a photograph, grainy, almost vintage in tone, showed Captain Thorne's grave. A jagged crack split the stone clean across the name as if something heavy had been slammed into it. This was no coincidence. This was a message. Elias stared at the photo, his jaw tightening, fingers curling at the edges of the envelope. The air in his office seemed to shift, growing colder. Not because of temperature, but purpose. Thorne had risked everything to expose Lorne. Now someone wanted Elias to know that the sacrifice hadn't ended with a funeral. It was continuing, in threats, in silence, and in shadows. Within the hour, Colonel Hale, his most trusted government contact, was officially reassigned. The message came in a clipped communiqué. Operational transfer pending internal security review. In other words, removed, silenced, distanced. He was alone now, the moment he had feared and prepared for. Elias summoned Damon Stroud and Rylan Keene to the subterranean briefing room beneath Valor Corps' Ralden HQ. The space was shielded, soundproofed, and lined with reinforced composite alloy. It was where contingency plans were born. Rylan entered first, his legal brief in hand, eyes scanning the room with familiar caution. Damon followed, wearing a shoulder rig beneath his coat, ever the soldier even in civilian halls. Elias didn't sit. He stood beside the central holotable, tapping in the access code that brought up a 3-dimensional web of files, names, encrypted nodes, his entire post-incident countermeasures map. "They're not done," Elias said flatly. Damon folded his arms. "What happened?" Elias dropped the envelope on the table. "That happened." Rylan read the note aloud, then studied the photo with a grimace. "This isn't a threat. It's a promise." "I know," Elias replied. "That's why we're making the first move." He tapped again, and the diagram reshaped into 3 core pillars. Assets, access, optics. If they're resurfacing, they'll come after leverage, money, files, or fear, Elias said. "We deny them all 3. Rylan's brow furrowed. "You're talking about a full data migration?" "Offshore. Encrypted, isolated from domestic jurisdictions, and legal assets? Transferred under emergency corporate immunity protocols. If they try to freeze us, they'll hit legal walls they won't see coming." Damon stepped closer. "And fear?" Elias looked at him directly. "We give them no silence to manipulate." The following 48 hours passed in high-speed silence. Valor Corps' data servers were rerouted through decentralized cloud vessels, then mirrored to a secure arc in Varkan, a sovereign neutral zone known for its airtight encryption laws. Rylan personally oversaw the reclassification of all company legal assets, shifting ownership proxies through layered trusts. Meanwhile, Damon led the internal audit team to sniff out any latent breaches left behind by Directorate loyalists. But the real strike came through a different channel, the airwaves. Elias prepared a televised statement, careful not to paint himself as a victim or hero. This was about vigilance, not vengeance. He stood alone in front of a dark backdrop. No logos, no flags, just truth. "This message," he began, "is not about punishment. It is about accountability." His voice didn't shake. His eyes didn't blink, and every word carried a weight measured in risk. "If you believe silence protects you, then let my voice remind you, silence is brittle." The message aired across global platforms, rebroadcast within hours on all major security channels. Social feeds flooded with commentary. Government agencies scrambled to respond, pressured by the public to reopen the investigation they had tried to bury. 2 days later, a raid, quiet and surgical, was conducted on one of Helvian Strategic Holdings' remaining data centers. It wasn't an office anymore, just a steel shell used for off-record contract storage. But what the raid recovered was decisive. Hard drives, contracts, payment trails. Every thread led back to the same names: Rusk and Dalen. Their signatures appeared on ghost operations involving sabotage, silent blackouts, and false flag inspections. Even more damning, project codenames matched the ones inside Elias's stolen briefcase. The drives proved complicity. They also proved coordination. When the files were shown to Elias, he didn't flinch. He simply exhaled, slow and deep, the kind of breath that only comes after a storm has passed, but the sky hasn't cleared. There were no celebrations, no headlines to bask under, just confirmation that justice had moved one step forward, even if it limped. Outside his office, the sun dipped below Ralden's skyline, bathing the buildings in rust-colored light. Elias leaned against the window, watching the world move without knowing the lines that had been crossed to keep it upright. Behind him, the empty envelope lay in a burn box, curling to ash. He whispered to no one in particular, "Peace is just another kind of vigilance." The sound of footsteps echoed softly against the polished floor as Elias Varen stepped through the main entrance of the newly renamed Norvale Justice Terminal. There were no cameras flashing, no microphones thrust toward his face, no chants or cheers. Just a quiet murmur of acknowledgement, a shift in posture, a nod from a uniformed officer, the subtle parting of travelers in the security line as they made room for a man whose story had reshaped the very ground they stood on. He didn't need an escort. His presence moved like a current, noticed but unobtrusive, and the silence that followed him was not fear, it was respect. The same checkpoint stood before him, though now it bore a plaque affixed to the wall, gleaming beneath the overhead lights. In honor of accountability, justice, and those who stood firm. The mirrored wall beside it, once a silent witness to his humiliation, reflected a man unchanged in form but transformed in purpose. Colonel Mason Hale stood at the side of the plaque, dressed in full uniform. The silver eagle insignia on his chest caught the light as he approached Elias and extended a firm hand. "You didn't just survive this place," Hale said, his voice low and measured. "You rebuilt it." Elias shook his hand, but his expression remained composed, unreadable. Justice isn't rebuilt. It's maintained, or it rots. Hale gave a short nod. There was nothing left to say between them. The courts had spoken. Rusk and Dalen had been sentenced for misconduct and evidence tampering. Director Halvor Lorne, the architect of the sabotage, was now facing a federal tribunal for corruption and espionage. Yet Elias felt no satisfaction in their downfall, only caution. He moved past the checkpoint slowly, eyes scanning every detail. The scanners had been upgraded, personnel retrained, body cams made mandatory, and a third-party review board installed, all because of what happened to him. Valor Core Systems had since recovered from its momentary suspension, even expanded into new sectors, and Elias himself had been offered a cabinet advisory role, an offer he declined. A young security attendant, barely out of training judging by his badge, stepped forward nervously. His posture was straight, but his eyes betrayed the weight of the moment. "Sir," he said, voice barely above a whisper, "thank you for making airports safer." Elias turned to him slowly. He didn't smile, but his gaze softened. "Just do your job," he said. "That's all anyone ever needed to do." As he walked deeper into the terminal, the sounds of travel resumed around him, rolling suitcases, gate announcements, idle chatter. But to Elias, it felt different now. The air carried a new weight, not heavy, but purposeful. This place was no longer a trap. It was a test. He approached the mirrored wall again, pausing in front of it. There, months ago, he had been cornered, belt loosened, dignity stripped, a gun inches from his chest. He stared at his reflection now. Tailored suit, calm eyes, a face that had faced down a system and refused to bow. But he didn't see victory in that reflection. He saw warning. Behind him, Damon Stroud was seated in a corner lounge pretending to read a newspaper. Ryland Keene sat nearby with a laptop open, casually monitoring encrypted feeds. They had insisted on trailing Elias subtly, just in case. Rusk and Dalen's convictions hadn't erased the lingering thread of sympathizers still loyal to the corrupted chain. Elias knew all too well, justice delivered once didn't ensure its survival. It had to be defended again and again, often by those who didn't ask for the responsibility but carried it anyway. A flight boarding call echoed through the speakers. Gate B-12, Ralden City, on time. He turned from the glass, his reflection fading with each step forward. At the gate, a crew member greeted him with a respectful nod. Elias returned it silently and crossed the threshold. As he moved through the final security barrier, the memory of Creer's smirk, Rusk's drawn gun, and Dalen's mocking tone flickered behind his eyes. Not as ghosts, but as lessons etched into his resolve. History didn't change because someone stood still. It changed when someone refused to step back. At the gate's edge, he paused, then glanced over his shoulder one last time, toward the mirrored wall. The checkpoint. The place it all began. They aimed guns at a man to break him, he thought, glancing back one last time, but all they did was aim history toward its reckoning. Sometimes, dignity is the most powerful weapon of all. They pointed their weapon at the wrong man, and watched their arrogance collapse when he raised his own. If you believe justice always stands its ground, subscribe now, because courage doesn't flinch before power. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores racism, power abuse, and the double standards faced by Black professionals even in positions of authority. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and spark reflection on justice, accountability, and equal treatment under the law.